She dropped to her knees in the dust and tore the wedding veil from her hair, crushing it in both fists as the whole town watched her break. No groom, no money, no mercy. Just a stranger's cruel note pressed into her shaking hands and 40 faces deciding she was nothing. If your heart's ever been abandoned by someone who swore they'd stay, this story is for you. Subscribe now and stay with me all the way to the end, and tell me in the comments what city you're listening from, so I can see how far this story travels. The veil came apart in Clara Whitmore's hands. She hadn't meant to ruin it. She'd meant to hold it the way she'd held it for 11 days on the train from Boston, folded in tissue paper on her lap, like something holy. But now it was on the ground in the dust of Dust Hollow, Wyoming, and her knuckles had gone white around the torn lace, and she couldn't seem to make her fingers open. "Read it again," she whispered. The boy who'd delivered the note shifted his weight. He was maybe 14, sunburnt across the nose, and he'd already backed up 2 steps. "Ma'am, I only carried it. I don't—" "Read it to me." Her voice cracked in the middle of the word. "Please, I need to hear it out loud. I need to be sure I read it right." I didn't want to. She could see that. But something in her face made him take the paper back from her, and he read it in the flat, careful way of a child who hadn't yet learned that some words shouldn't be said gently. "Miss Whitmore, I regret that circumstances have changed. I have entered into marriage with Miss Eleanor Cross of the Cross Cattle Concern. There is no place for you here now. I trust you will find your own way. J. Ambrose." Silence. Then somewhere behind her, a woman laughed. It wasn't a big laugh. It was small and sharp, and it cut clean through the heat, and it did more damage than the note had. Clara turned her head and saw them, the whole platform of Dust Hollow, arranged in a loose half-circle, the way people gather around a thing that's already been decided. Miners with dust in the creases of their faces. 2 women in calico, arms folded. A man leaning in the shade of the depot with a toothpick and a smile. They weren't looking at her with sorrow. They were looking at her the way people look at a horse that's gone lame at the auction. Calculating. A little pleased. "Boston," one of the calico women said to the other, not bothering to lower her voice. "You can always tell. Comes out here in her good dress thinking a man's word is worth the paper it's writ on." "Weren't even writ on paper," the other said. "That's a telegram boy's hand." "Then it's worth less." Clara got to her feet. She didn't remember deciding to. Her knees were shaking, and the dust had ground itself into the pale green of her prairie dress, and she could feel every eye on the 3 trunks beside her. The trunks that held everything she owned in the world. Everything she'd sold her mother's furniture to bring west. Everything she'd packed with such stupid, tender hope. "Where is he?" she asked. Nobody answered. "I asked where he is." Louder now. Her teacher's voice, the one that had quieted rooms full of 8-year-olds. It didn't quiet these people. It made the man with the toothpick smile wider. "Josiah Ambrose. He telegraphed me a proposal. He telegraphed me a ticket. I have his letters in that trunk, 4 months of them. Where is he?" "On his honeymoon, I expect," said the toothpick man. The laughter came again, bigger this time, rolling through the half-circle, and Clara felt her face go hot, and then very cold. She understood in that moment something she would carry for the rest of her life, that a person could lose everything they had in the span of an afternoon, and the world would not stop, and worse, the world would find it funny. "He owes me an explanation," she said. Her voice was steadier now. Fury did that. "He owes me at least that. I traveled 2,000 miles. Owes you." The toothpick man pushed off the wall of the depot and ambled toward her, unhurried, and she made herself stand still, though every nerve told her to step back. He was heavy-set, and his vest strained at the buttons, and up close he smelled of whiskey and horse. "Miss, out here a man don't owe a woman a thing but what he chooses to give. And Josiah Ambrose married up. Cross money. You think he's gonna answer to a school teacher? I think. You think." He looked at her up and down slow, and she felt it like a hand. "Well, ain't that a fine thing? A pretty woman with 3 trunks and no man, and a head full of thinking." He glanced back at the crowd playing to them. "Tell you what I think. I think you're gonna need a place to stay tonight, and I've got rooms above the Silver Garter. Real reasonable for a lady." Someone whistled low. Clara understood that too. She understood it all at once, the way you understand you've stepped onto ice by the sound it makes. The Silver Garter was not a hotel, and the rooms above it were not for sleeping, and this man was not offering her charity. "I would rather," she said very clearly, "sleep in the street. That can be arranged." He was still smiling, but his eyes had gone flat. "Only the street out here ain't safe for a woman alone after dark, miss. Lot of rough men come down from the mines. A body needs looking after." "Step back from her." The voice came from behind Clara. Low. Even. Not loud at all, and yet the whole platform seemed to hear it, because the smile fell off the toothpick man's face like a plate off a shelf. Clara turned. Howe was standing at the edge of the platform, where the shade of the water tower fell, and she had the sense that he'd been standing there a while, watching, deciding. A tall man. Broad through the shoulders, in the way of men who've done hard labor their whole lives, rather than lifted weights for sport. Dark hair going gray at the temples, a thick beard, a face burnt brown and lined deep by weather, and something else. Something closed, guarded like a door that had been shut a long time. He wore a leather vest gone soft with age and a brown hat pulled low, and he did not look like a man who spent much time in town. Howe was looking at the toothpick man. He hadn't looked at Clara at all. "Walker," the toothpick man said, and his voice had changed. There was something under the bluster now, something wary. "This ain't your business." "You're right." The man called Walker took one step forward. Just one. His boots were quiet on the boards. "It ain't. Made it my business the second you offered a stranded woman a room in Delph's whorehouse in front of the whole town. Now step back." I heard what you was only." Another step. He was between Clara and the crowd now, though she didn't think he'd done it on purpose. It was just where he'd ended up. "Go on back to your shade, Harmon, before I remember what you owe me from the spring cattle drive and decide today's the day to collect it in front of everybody." Harmon's jaw worked. For a moment, Clara thought he might say something, do something. But the man called Walker just stood there, patient and still as a fence post, and there was something in that stillness worse than any threat. And after a long moment, Harmon spat to the side and turned away. "Ain't worth it," he muttered. "None of it's worth it. She's your problem now, Walker." The crowd began to break up. Slowly, reluctantly, the way a crowd does when the show is over, but hasn't quite paid off the way they'd hoped. The calico women lingered longest whispering, and one of them said something Clara couldn't hear, that made the other one cackle, and then they went too. And then it was just the two of them, and the trunks, and the ruined veil in the dust. The man Walker still hadn't looked at her. He was looking out at the town, at the street beyond the depot, at the low sun, and the long shadows, and the swinging sign of the Silver Garter down the road. When he finally spoke, it wasn't to comfort her. It wasn't anything she'd braced herself for. "You got anybody in this town?" he asked. "Anybody at all? Kin friend, a person you wrote to?" "No." "The man who sent for you? Any chance he'll come around when he's had time to think on it?" Clara looked at the note still crushed in her hand. "He married a rancher's daughter for the money. I don't imagine he'll be thinking on me." Walker nodded slowly, as if she'd confirmed something he'd already guessed. "Any money of your own?" "I had—" Her throat closed. She made herself say it. "I had $40. I paid the freight on the trunks. The ticket didn't cover the trunks." He'd said— She stopped because he'd said was the beginning of too many sentences, now all of them ash. "I have about $6. $6. He said it without judgment, just weighing it. "Room at the boarding house is $1 a night, and Widow Pruitt won't take a woman with no husband and no reference, so that don't matter anyhow. Stage out of here runs Thursdays. It's Saturday." He was quiet a moment. "You know how to shoot?" "No." "You know anybody who'd take you in for work?" "I'm a teacher," Clara said, and even to her own ears, it sounded like something from another life, something she was reciting rather than being. "I taught primary letters and arithmetic for 6 years. I have a certificate. Dust Hollow's got a schoolhouse with 11 kids and a teacher already," Walker said. "Name's Pierce. Been here 9 years and ain't going nowhere." He finally turned his head and looked at her, and his eyes were dark brown and very steady, and gave away nothing. I'm telling you this, so you understand your situation clear. There ain't a job for you here. There ain't a bed for you here that isn't over the garter. And there ain't a soul in this town gonna lift a finger, because they've already decided what you are. You follow me." Clara's chin came up. It was the last thing she had, and she brought it up. "You've made it very plain." "Wasn't trying to be cruel." "I know what you were trying to be." Her voice shook, and she hated that it shook. "You were trying to make sure I understand that I'm ruined." "Well, I understand. Was there something else, Mr. Walker, or have you finished?" Something moved in his face. Not a smile. She didn't think this man smiled much, but something. A flicker quickly gone. "Ethan," he said. "Ethan Walker. And no, I ain't finished. You had it near right, but you got the last part wrong." He looked at her a moment longer. "I ain't like this town." Clara said nothing. "I got a place up the mountain. Cattle, mostly some horses. It's a hard piece of country, and it's a 2-hour ride, and it ain't got a soul on it, but me and the animals." He said this plainly, the way a man lays out terms. "There's a second room. Was my sister's before she went east. It's got a door that bolts from the inside. You can have it tonight, and any night you need it, and there's honest work to earn your keep if you're willing to learn it, which I expect will be the hardest thing you ever done in your life." He paused. "I'm not offering you what Harmon offered you. I want that understood between us plain right now before you decide. You'd be safe. You have my word for whatever a stranger's word is worth to you today, which I reckon ain't much." Clara stared at him. An hour ago, she'd been a bride. She'd stepped off that train and straightened her collar and touched the veil in her lap and thought, "This is the moment my new life begins." And it had begun just not the way she'd planned. It had begun with a boy reading a note in the wrong gentle voice. And now, a mountain came down to a strange man's offer, and everything in her upbringing, everything her mother had ever taught her, everything a decent Boston woman was supposed to know, screamed that she could not. That a woman did not ride off alone with a man she'd met an hour past. That it was madness, that it was ruin of a different kind. But her mother was dead. And decent Boston had put her on a train to a man who'd sold her for cattle money. And the sun was going down over a town that had already laughed at her. "Why?" she asked. It came out barely above a whisper. "Why would you do this? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. Mr. Harmon said it himself out here, a man doesn't owe a woman anything." Ethan Walker looked out at the town again, at the sign of the Silver Garter, and his jaw tightened, and for the first time she saw something in him that wasn't stone. "Because I stood on a platform like this one once," he said. "Different town, long time back. And I watched people decide what I was before they knew the first true thing about me. And there was one man stepped up when nobody else would." He was quiet a moment. "He's dead now. I never paid him back. Man like that you can't pay back. You can only pass it on." He bent and picked up the heaviest of her 3 trunks, hauling it onto his shoulder in one motion, as though it weighed nothing. "You don't have to come," he said, not looking at her. "You can say the word, and I'll carry these back inside the depot and leave you $6, and my sincere hope you find better than this town. But the sun's going, and I got a long ride, and the animals don't care that my day got complicated, so I need to know." Clara looked at the crushed veil in her hand. She thought of Josiah Ambrose, whom she had never met, whose handwriting she had loved, who had written her 4 months of letters about the life they'd build, and had married a stranger for money, and dismissed her in 3 sentences, signed with an initial. She thought of the calico women. You can always tell. She thought of her mother in the last weeks holding her hand and saying, "Promise me you won't settle, Clara. Promise me you'll go where you're wanted." She had thought Josiah wanted her. She let the veil fall from her fingers. It drifted down into the dust and lay there torn and gray, and she did not pick it up. "I don't know how to do any of it," she said. Her voice was steadier now. "I've never sat a horse. I've never cooked over a fire. I don't know one end of a fence from another. If you take me up that mountain, Mr. Walker, you'll be taking a burden. I want you to understand that before you decide, same as you wanted me to understand my situation. I'll be no use to you for a long while, maybe never." Ethan Walker settled the trunk more securely on his shoulder. "I didn't ask if you knew how," he said. "I asked if you were willing to learn." "I'm willing." The words came out of her before she'd decided to say them, and she felt something shift in her chest as she said them. Not hope exactly. It was too soon and too raw for hope, but the ground beneath hope. The first plank of a floor. I'm willing to learn. Then that's all I need. He nodded at the smaller trunks. You can carry that one. Other one will come back for with the wagon. I got a horse tied at the livery. Town's too far from my place to walk it, and I don't reckon those boots of yours were made for the trail. Clara looked down at her boots. Her good boots. Her Boston boots, thin-soled and pretty. Then she bent and took hold of the smaller trunk. It was heavier than it looked. She got both arms around it and lifted, and it dug into her forearms, and she thought her back might give, but she held it. Ethan watched her do it without offering to help, and she understood later that this was the first lesson, though neither of them named it so. They walked down off the platform together. The ruined bride and the mountain man, and the town watched them go from behind curtains and around corners. Clara felt the eyes. She kept her chin up. At the livery, Ethan's horse was a big-boned dun with a white blaze and a scarred flank, and it turned its head and looked at Clara with a flat dark eye that seemed to hold the same opinion of her as the calico women had. His name's Barrow, Ethan said, tying her trunk behind the saddle with quick sure knots. He won't hurt you. He might test you. He glanced at her. Most things up the mountain will test you. That's not cruelty. That's just how it is. A thing's got to know if you'll fold before it decides whether to trust you. Including you? Clara asked. He paused, his hands going still on the rope. Including me, he admitted. He mounted first, swinging up easy despite his size, and then he reached his hand down to her. She looked at it, a big hand calloused, scarred across 2 knuckles, brown as saddle leather. She thought of every reason not to take it. She thought of her mother. Go where you're wanted. She took it. He pulled her up behind him with a strength that took her breath, settling her behind the saddle, and she had to put her arms around his waist to keep her seat, and she felt the strangeness of it. This man she'd known 1 hour, this heat off his back, this heartbeat. She could feel through the worn leather of his vest, steady and slow, a man who did not panic. Hold on, he said. And whatever you're feeling right now. He hesitated, and it was the only time all day. His own voice caught just slightly, just enough for her to hear that whatever was behind that closed door in him was not empty. Whatever you're feeling, you don't have to name it today. Country's got a way of sorting a person out if they'll let it. He clicked to the horse. Clara Whitmore took one last look at Dust Hollow, Wyoming, at the depot, and the silver garter, and the calico women in a doorway, and the small torn shape of her wedding veil, abandoned in the dust of the platform, the last relic of the woman she'd been that morning. Then Barrow carried them out of the town and toward the darkening line of the mountains, and she did not look back again. They rode a long while before either of them spoke. The town fell away behind them, and the road became a track, and the track became a trail. Climbing, and the heat of the day began to break as the sun dropped toward the peaks. Clara's arms ached from holding on. Her thin boots were the wrong things entirely. Everything about her was the wrong thing for where she was going, and she knew it, and she held on anyway. How far? She asked when the silence had gone on so long it had started to feel like its own kind of weight. 2 hours near enough. Trail gets steeper up top. We'll walk the horse the last stretch. A pause. You warm enough? Gets cold quick once the sun's behind the ridge. There's a coat rolled behind you. I'm all right. You're shivering. I said I'm all right, Mr. Walker. He didn't argue. But a mile on, without a word, he stopped. The horse twisted around, took the coat himself and put it over her shoulders, rough and impersonal, the way you'd blanket a horse, and then he faced front again and clicked Barrow on before she could refuse it. Clara pulled the coat close. It smelled of wood smoke and horse and something green pine, maybe. It was the warmest she'd been all day. Thank you, she said quietly. He grunted. It was not a warm sound, but it was not a cold one either. You said your sister lived up here, Clara said after a while. She didn't know why she said it. Maybe because the silence had teeth. Maybe because she needed to make him a person, and not just a broad back and a stranger's kindness she couldn't yet trust. You said the room was hers. Was. Where did she go? East. Married a dry goods man in Omaha. His voice didn't change, but his shoulders did a slight set to them. She hated it up here. Every day of it. Used to tell me a body wasn't meant to live this alone. That I'd wake up an old man someday with nothing but cattle to bury me. A long pause. Reckon she was right about most of it. Clara said nothing. She was learning already, though she didn't know it, the first shape of him, that Ethan Walker gave you the truth flat, and then went quiet, and that the quiet after was not a wall to knock down, but a room he was letting you stand in. She leave the door bolt? Clara asked. You said it bolts from inside. She put it in herself. First month she was here. Didn't trust the country either. He was quiet a moment. You'll want it. Not from me, I already give you my word and I don't break it. But there's line riders come through some seasons, and cattlemen from the low range, and it's a comfort to a woman to know a door locks. My sister taught me that. I put a lot of stock in it. That's... Clara stopped, surprised. That's a considerate thing to think of. It's a decent thing, Ethan said. There's a difference. Considerate is manners. Decent is just not being a coward about what's right. He shifted the reins. This town back there, they got manners. Tip their hats, say ma'am. Not one of 'em decent enough to give a stranded woman a chair. You'll learn to tell the two apart up here. Country strips a man down to which one he actually is. Clara held that. She turned it over the way she'd once turned over lines of poetry with her students, looking for the thing underneath the thing. And which one are you? She asked. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. I aim to be decent, he said at last. Don't always manage it, but I aim. A beat. That's the most honest thing I can tell you about myself, ma'am, and I'd rather you had it now than found it out disappointed later. I'm not a warm man. I'm not going to be easy to live near. I keep to myself, and I like the quiet, and I've got no gift at all for the things a person like you probably needs. Comfort, conversation, all that. My sister used to say, living with me was like living next to a mountain. It don't hurt you, it just don't talk back. Clara felt something unexpected then. It was small, and it surprised her, and it came in the middle of the worst day of her life. It was almost the beginning of a smile. Mr. Walker, she said, I have spent the last 4 months in love with a man's handwriting. I built an entire future out of a stranger's promises. Comfort and conversation and warmth. Those are the very things that ruined me. I think perhaps a mountain is exactly what I need. Ethan Walker didn't answer for a moment. Then he said very low, almost to himself, Reckon we'll see. And the horse climbed on up into the last of the light, carrying the abandoned bride and the lonely mountain cowboy toward a cabin she'd never seen, and a life she couldn't yet imagine, and a truth neither of them was ready to speak, that both of them had been left behind by someone once, and that both of them had learned the same hard lesson from it, and that lesson was carrying them mile by mile closer to the only thing that had ever healed it. Not a promise, not a pretty letter, not a word said warm to win them, just someone who chose to stay. The last of the sun went gold and then red behind the ridge, and Clara Whitmore, who had lost everything. Before noon, felt the strange coat warm around her shoulders and the steady heartbeat of a stranger beneath her hands. And for the first time since the boy had read that note in his wrong, gentle voice, she was not afraid. She was only tired and cold and climbing, and that she would come to understand was the difference between the woman she had been that morning and the woman the mountain was going to make of her. She had climbed. Clara learned the first lesson of the mountain before dawn. She learned it not from Ethan, and not from any book, and not from anything she could have prepared for in Boston. She learned it from the cold. It came through the walls of the cabin in the hours before light, a deep, bone-serious cold that had nothing in common with the winters. She'd known the polite New England cold that stayed outside and let you pretend indoors was a different world. This cold didn't negotiate. It came under the door and through the gaps in the logs and settled into her like something that had always been there waiting. She lay on the narrow bed in Ethan's sister's room, the one with the bolt on the inside that she had absolutely shot home the moment the door closed, and she stared at the ceiling and listened to the silence. She had never heard silence like this. In Boston, there was always something: carts, voices, the mill on the river. Even at night the city breathed. Here the silence was so complete, She could hear her own heartbeat and the sound of the embers settling in the small stove Ethan had lit for her before he disappeared into his own room without another word. No good night. No see you in the morning. He had pointed at the stove, shown her how to keep it fed, set a blanket on the chair, and gone. She should have been terrified. She was a little. But underneath the fear was something else she couldn't name. Something that wasn't quite peace and wasn't quite exhaustion. A strange quietness of her own, like the moment after crying when your body finally decides to stop. She had nothing. She was nowhere. She knew no one. And nobody was about to betray her because there was nobody here to betray her. She fell asleep thinking of Josiah Ambrose's handwriting. The careful loops of his A's, the way he'd signed every letter, yours faithfully, and she woke to the sound of boots on a wood floor and the smell of coffee. And for one broken second, she forgot where she was and thought she was home in Boston, and that this had all been a dream. Then she heard the horse in the yard, and it came back, and she lay still for a count of 10, the way her mother had taught her. 10 counts to feel it. Then you get up. She got up. When she unbolted the door and came into the main room, Ethan was already gone. There was coffee on the stove and a piece of bread on the table, and a note written in spare, angular handwriting that read, "Need to be somewhere. Back before noon. Don't go past the fence line." Clara looked at the note for a long moment. Then she looked at the bread and the coffee. She sat down and drank the coffee and ate the bread because she was hungry enough that pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. And then she looked at the door to outside and thought about what a woman did when she woke up alone on a mountain she didn't know with a man she'd met 24 hours ago and no plan beyond the next 10 minutes. She decided she would wash her face and find out what needed doing. This turned out to be the second lesson of the mountain, though she didn't know it yet. The mountain didn't care what had happened to you yesterday. It only cared what you did right now. She found a basin near the door and a water bucket that was half empty, and she went looking for the well. She found it around the side of the cabin, a hand-dug well with a rope and bucket. And the rope was rougher than anything she'd handled, and her arms were sore from the ride, and the water was ice cold, and she spilled half of it on her dress before she got the basin filled. She stood there dripping and cold in the summer morning and thought, nobody is going to come fix this. That thought, she would later realize, was when everything began. She was wringing out her hem when she heard the horse come back into the yard earlier than noon by a long way, and she walked around the corner of the cabin to find Ethan already dismounted, and beside him a second horse, and across that horse's back, heavy and terrible, the body of a calf, still and small. He pulled the calf down alone, careful not rough, and laid it in the grass, and then he saw Clara, and he went very still for a moment, and something moved across his face. Not surprise exactly. More like a man who's come home with something bad and hasn't decided yet what to do with it. "What happened?" Clara asked. "Mountain lion got to the pasture last night." He crouched beside the calf, his hand resting briefly on the animal's side, and the gesture was so small and private that Clara felt she'd seen something she hadn't been meant to see. "This one didn't make it. Got the other one penned. It's hurt, but it'll live." He stood. "Gonna be a hard morning." "What do you need?" Clara asked. He looked at her. The question seemed to take him off guard. What do you need me to do?" "You said there's work to earn my keep. Tell me what to do, and I'll do it." Ethan studied her face for a long second, the way he might study a stretch of trail to see if it would hold weight. "You ever tend a hurt animal?" he asked. "No." "You afraid of blood?" Clara thought of her mother's last weeks. "No." He jerked his head toward the far pen, and she followed him. And that was the morning she learned that livestock injuries were not like anything she'd imagined, and that Ethan Walker's hands, which were blunt and scarred and incapable of what she'd have called gentleness, were nevertheless entirely gentle with a frightened calf, and that watching a person be kind to an animal who couldn't thank them told you something truer about that person than anything they could ever say about themselves. She held the calf still while he cleaned and dressed the wound, and the calf fought her. It was strong and scared, and didn't understand that being held was for its own good, and she didn't let go, and when it was done, Ethan looked up at her and gave a single short nod. "Not bad," he said. It was the highest praise he was capable of. She would learn that later. Right now, it landed in her chest like something warm she didn't know what to do with. "You're going to need different clothes," he said, looking at what was left of her dress. "I have trunks. Not for this. Those Boston clothes aren't built for this work. My sister left a few things. You're near her size. I'll get them." He said it matter-of-factly, without apology or sentiment, and went into the cabin and came back with a worn pair of trousers and a heavy cotton shirt and a belt and work boots that were 2 sizes too big. He set them on the fence rail and went back to the calf without another word. Clara held the bundle and looked at it for a moment. In Boston, she had not worn trousers in her life. She was a school teacher. She had standards. She had a reputation. She had nothing, she reminded herself. She had nothing, and she was nowhere, and the dress she was wearing had blood on it and had already survived 2,000 miles and 1 abandoned wedding. Standards were for women who had options. She changed in the cabin and came back out, and the boots clumped on the ground like something was wearing her instead of the other way around. And when Ethan turned and saw her, he blinked just once quickly, and she thought, "Don't you dare laugh at me," and he didn't. He just said, "Socks. Second drawer, 2 pairs." She went and found the socks. This was how the first week passed. Not in conversation, in work. Ethan taught her by showing, not explaining. He would do a thing once at his own pace and then step aside, and whatever she did with it was her business. He didn't hover. He didn't repeat himself. He corrected her exactly once per mistake, and the correction was always short, always specific, and never unkind. Grip higher. Other way. Let the horse decide the speed. You don't drive them on a steep trail. You ask, and they answer. She was bad at nearly everything. She knew it, and he knew it, and neither of them mentioned it because there wasn't time to mention it between the doing and the failing and the doing again. She fell twice off the horse, once badly enough to tear the knee of her trousers and sit in the dirt for a full minute, deciding whether she was going to cry. She decided against it because Ethan was watching, and she discovered something useful. It was easier not to cry when someone was watching. Not because you were ashamed, but because you were too busy being something other than a person who cried. On the 4th day, she managed to stay on Barrow for a full hour on the trail, and something happened in Ethan's expression when she came back, a slight easing like a fist unclenching, and he said, "You've got a decent seat." And she didn't say anything because she was afraid whatever she said would make him stop. That evening, she cooked supper for the first time. She'd watched him do it 2 nights, and she was tired of watching things and not doing them. He came in from the last check of the herd to find her standing at the stove with a wooden spoon and a look on her face that was half determination and half panic. And the first thing he said was, "The pan's too hot." "I know," she said. "I just figured it out." He didn't take it from her. He stood behind her, a foot of space between them, and talked her through salvaging what could be salvaged and starting over on what couldn't. And when the food was done, it was not good, but it was edible, and they sat at the table, and he ate it without complaint, and she found herself unreasonably grateful for this. "It'll get better," she said about the food. "Most things do," he said. It was not a warm statement, but it hung in the air a moment, and neither of them looked at the other, and then the meal was done. What nobody had told Clara Whitmore, what she was discovering for herself in the space between one day and the next, was that the hardest part of starting over was not learning the new things. She had expected the new things to be hard. She was a teacher. She knew how to learn. The hardest part was the unlearning. It was discovering how many things she'd believed about her own worth, about what made a woman valuable, about what a life was supposed to look like, and watching all of it fall away in the mountain air, until she didn't know what was left underneath. Some mornings, she didn't know if she was building something or just dismantling herself. She thought about Josiah Ambrose's letters, which she had read so many times she had them close to memorized. "The West is a place where a person can remake themselves entirely, Miss Whitmore, where the old definitions don't hold." She'd thought he was talking about the two of them. A new life, a new start together. He'd been describing himself. He'd remade himself into a man who threw her away. And the West had let him. The West was also letting her do something, though she wasn't sure what yet. She found out on the 9th day. She had been riding the fence line alone. Ethan had started sending her out on the easy sections by herself. Not because he trusted her, she thought, but because he was a practical man, and the work needed doing, and she could do this much when she came around a stand of aspens and found a man she didn't know sitting on a horse in the middle of Ethan's pasture. How was well dressed for the range, which meant he was someone's hired man, or someone who had money to look like he wasn't, and he had two other riders behind him, and he was looking at the fence line with an expression she recognized. She'd seen it on men in Boston who were measuring something they intended to take. She pulled Barrow up short, and before she could think about whether it was wise, she said, "Can I help you?" The man turned and looked at her, and his expression shifted into something that tried to be polite and didn't quite manage it. "Didn't expect to find a woman out here," he said. "This Walker's place." "It is," Clara said. "And you're on the wrong side of his fence. The gate's half a mile back the way you came." "Gate." The man repeated the word like it was quaint. "Miss, we're just taking a look at this pasture. Mr. Grover Dean has an interest in the land on this side of the ridge, and we're confirming the surveys." "Mr. Walker's surveys, or Mr. Dean's?" The man's expression cooled. "Ma'am, I don't think you understand the nature of—" "I understand," Clara said, "that you're on private land without an invitation, and that I don't know your name, and that a surveying party doesn't typically ride through a pasture with cattle in it without so much as a by your leave." She kept her voice level. She was a teacher. She had steadied rooms full of children who were bigger than this situation. "I'll tell Mr. Walker you called. If Mr. Dean wants to discuss his interests, Mr. Walker can be found at the cabin most evenings." She held the man's gaze until he was the one who looked away. "Friendly woman you got up here," he said to the riders behind him, making it a small insult, and they turned their horses. Clara waited until they were gone before she let out the breath she'd been holding. Her hands were shaking on the reins. Barrow turned his head and looked back at her with that flat, dark eye, and she thought he looked almost approving. "Don't say anything," she told the horse. She rode straight back to the cabin and told Ethan everything in order, without drama, and without softening any of it. He stood very still while she talked the way a man stands when something cold has touched the back of his neck. When she finished, he said, "Dean," just the name low and flat, and his jaw went tight. "You know him. I know of him." Ethan went to the window and looked out toward the ridge, and there was something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Not fear, nothing like it, but something older and harder. Anger, maybe. Or something that had been around long enough to have learned patience. "Grover Dean owns most of the South Valley. He's been pushing north for 2 years. Tried to buy me out twice. Tried through the bank once." He was quiet. "He doesn't survey land he doesn't intend to take. He'd take this land legally." Legally. The word came out with a kind of weight. "He's got a lawyer in town. He's got the county assessor. He's got a judge in Sheridan who owes him favors. Whether what he does is legal depends on who's doing the deciding." He turned from the window. "What exactly did this man say, the one doing the talking?" "He said they were confirming the surveys. He said Mr. Dean had an interest in the land on this side of the ridge. This side of the ridge is my father's land, my grandfather's before that. The deed's older than Grover Dean's money." He said it quietly, but every word was its own weight dropped separately. "They're looking for a weakness in the boundary, a gap they can exploit." His eyes went to her. "You told him to leave." "I did." "He did." He didn't seem pleased about it, but yes. Something moved in Ethan's face then behind the anger, something she didn't have a name for yet. He looked at her the way he'd looked at the calf when she'd held it still, like she'd done something he hadn't expected. "You weren't afraid," he said. "I was terrified," Clara said. "But I was on your land and he had no right and—" She stopped, surprised by her own answer, by the word "you're" in her mouth sounding so solid, so possessive. "I wasn't going to let him think otherwise." Ethan nodded slowly. He picked up his hat from the table and put it on and said, "I need to ride down to the Halloran place. Tom Halloran needs to know Dean's men are ranging this far north." He paused at the door. "You did right," he said, telling him to leave. A beat. More than right. I went out. Clara sat down at the table because her legs had decided they were done pretending to be steady, and she sat there for a long time in the quiet of the cabin, and she thought about what it had felt like to tell that man to get off this land, the sureness of it, the clarity, The way her voice had come out level and real without her having to think about it. In Boston, a woman's authority came from her husband or her father, or the position she held within a society that had decided what she was worth. She had none of that here. She'd had nothing here but the fact of being on Ethan's land and knowing in some wordless way that it was right. She had told the truth and stood on solid ground, and that she was beginning to understand was a different kind of authority entirely. Ethan came back at dusk, and he was quiet all through supper, quieter than usual, which was saying something, and Clara had learned enough by now not to push at his silences. But when the meal was done and the plates were cleared, he put both hands flat on the table and said, "Halloran tells me Dean's men have been through 4 properties this week. He's moving fast." He looked at her. Tom asked who the woman was who turned his men back, said they rode through his north pasture the same afternoon, and they were, he said, careful, like they were expecting to be told off again. Clara felt something she didn't have a good word for. "Dean's not going to stop with surveys," Ethan said. "Sooner or later he's going to push harder. I want you to know that. This place, it was going to be quiet for you, and I meant it to be quiet, and it's not going to be." "Was it ever?" Clara asked. He almost smiled. It wasn't quite, but it was close enough. "No," he admitted. "Guess not." He leaned back in his chair. "You're not afraid of Dean." "I don't know Dean. Most people who know him are afraid of him. Most people who knew Josiah Ambrose thought he was honest," Clara said. "I've learned recently that reputation isn't always the same as reality." Ethan looked at her across the table, and for a moment neither of them moved, and it was the first time Clara felt the weight of this, of the two of them here in this cabin, in this mountain, in whatever this was, as something more than an arrangement. Something that had its own shape now. Something that was beginning to take up actual space. "My sister," Ethan said out of nowhere, looking down at the table, "used to say I was the loneliest man she'd ever known and the stubbornest about it." "She wasn't wrong," Clara said carefully, "from what I've seen." "No." He was quiet. "She wasn't wrong." He looked up and his eyes were tired in a way that had nothing to do with the day's work. "I had a wife once, before the ranch, before I came back up here. She left after 3 years. Said the mountain was more important to me than she was." He said it plainly, not asking for sympathy. "She wasn't wrong either." "Was she?" He was quiet for a long time. "I don't think I knew the difference then," he said, "between loving a place and using it to hide." He stood picking up his cup. "I know it better now. Not sure what to do with knowing it, but I know it." He went to the stove. "You should sleep," he said, his back to her. "Fence line on the east section needs doing tomorrow, and I want an early start." Clara sat there a moment more. "Ethan," she said. He turned. "The woman who left." She stopped choosing her words. "It wasn't only about the mountain, was it? It was about you not letting her all the way in." He stood very still. "Good night, Miss Whitmore," he said quietly. She went to her room and slid the bolt and lay on the narrow bed in the dark, and she thought about a man who'd lived alone for a long time and still put a bolt on a door for a woman who wasn't there yet, and she thought about how that was not the act of a man who'd stopped believing in people. It was the act of a man who believed so deeply that he was afraid of what it would cost him when they left. In the morning she came out early and started the coffee before he was up. He came into the main room and stopped when he saw the stove already going, and he stood there for a moment with something crossing his face that she could only describe as unguarded, just for a second, just a breath before the familiar stillness returned. "You're up early," he said. "The mountain woke me," Clara said. "Apparently it's decided I live here now." Ethan took his cup off the shelf. "Apparently," he said. And whether it was the light or her own imagination, something about the way he said it sounded less like the door being shut, and more like the door being very slowly, very carefully left ajar. The second week was harder than the first, and the third harder than the second, and every day stripped another layer off the woman she'd been, until she couldn't always remember what was underneath. But she began to know what she was becoming. She could stay on the horse now for 3 hours without stopping. She could fix a fence rail by herself. She knew which cattle were which by their markings and their personalities, and she knew that the big red steer with the torn ear was smarter than he looked and would push a gate if you left it weak, and she knew the way the sky looked at 4 in the morning before a weather change, and she knew the sound of the aspen leaves right before the wind came. She knew Ethan's silences by their shape. The silence that meant he was thinking, the one that meant he was worried, the rarest one that meant he was in his own closed way content. She had not yet figured out what to do with being able to read him, or what it meant that she could. On the 17th day, something happened that none of Ethan's lessons had prepared her for. She came back to the cabin at midday to find a woman there. The woman was in her 50s, heavy-set and unsmiling, with sharp eyes that measured Clara once from top to bottom and didn't bother to hide the measurement. She was sitting at Ethan's table with a cup of coffee she'd helped herself to, and she looked at Clara the way the calico women in Dust Hollow had looked at her, except that behind the measurement there was something different, something sharper, less comfortable in itself. "You must be the Boston woman," the woman said. "I'm Clara Whitmore," Clara said. "And you are Nora Hadley. My husband runs the Double H below the tree line. We've been Ethan's neighbor for 14 years. She set her cup down. "I came to see for myself." "See what for yourself?" "Whether you were going to be a problem." Clara set down the bucket she'd been carrying and took the chair across from Nora Hadley and met her eyes directly. "I've been called a lot of things in the last few weeks, Mrs. Hadley. Problem is new. Would you like to be specific?" Nora studied her for a moment. "Ethan Walker has lived alone on this mountain for 11 years, she said. "This valley takes care of its own. When something changes, people want to understand what changed. A woman arrived unexpectedly, and he offered her shelter," Clara said. "That's what changed." "And are you planning to stay?" "I'm planning to earn my keep and learn this country and make myself useful. Beyond that—" Clara paused, and in the pause she found that she meant what she was about to say fully and completely, which surprised her. "Beyond that, I don't know. But I know I'm not a problem. And I know that Ethan Walker is a better man than this valley seems to give him credit for. And I would be very careful about coming into his home with questions about my intentions, when nobody here asked him one question about his." Silence. Nora Hadley looked at her for a long moment. Then, to Clara's complete astonishment, the woman smiled. Not warm, not easy, but real. "You told Harmon's men to get off the north pasture last week," she said. "Word travels. My husband said you must be something." "I'm a schoolteacher from Boston," Clara said. "We're taught to stand in front of things that won't behave." Nora laughed. It was loud and sharp and entirely genuine. "Good Lord," she said. "Where did you come from?" "I came from a platform in Dust Hollow," Clara said, "with nothing but 3 trunks and a ruined wedding veil, and I'm still here, which is more than I expected when the week started." Nora looked at her for a long moment, and then she nodded, slow and deliberate, and something shifted in her expression. The measuring quality gone, replaced by something that looked like respect, provisional and watchful, but there. "Ethan's going to need allies," Nora said. "Dean's moving on the whole North Range. Tom Halloran came to my husband yesterday. Dean's got his lawyer doing title searches on 3 properties, including this one. He's looking for anything survey errors, lapsed filings, anything that gives him legal standing." She leaned forward slightly. "He's also spreading stories, saying Ethan's failing, that the mountain ranch is slipping, that a man who takes in strays—" She stopped. "A man who takes in strays," Clara repeated quietly. "His word, not mine." "What's the purpose of the story?" "Makes him look weak," Nora said. "Makes the bank hesitant to extend any credit he might need. Makes the county less inclined to rule in his favor on a boundary dispute." She sat back. "Grover Dean is very good at this. He doesn't hit a man. He softens the ground under him until there's nothing left to stand on." Clara thought of Josiah Ambrose, who had done something similar to her. Not with violence, but with disappearance. With the deliberate withdrawal of everything he'd promised until she had no ground left either. "What does Ethan need?" she asked. Nora raised an eyebrow. "You're asking me what Ethan needs?" "You've known him 14 years. I've known him 3 weeks, so yes." Nora was quiet a moment, and in that quiet, Clara felt the shift again. Something being decided, permission being weighed. "He needs someone who won't leave when it gets hard," Nora said at last. That's what he's always needed. Not help with the land. Not another set of hands. That man can run this ranch in his sleep. He needs someone who stays. She stood pulling her coat. Whether you're that person? She gave Clara a long, final look. I suppose we'll see. She left, and Clara sat alone at the table, and the cabin was very quiet. Whether you're that person. She thought about Ethan's face that first morning when she'd seen the coffee already on. She thought about the bolt on the door he'd installed for a sister who hadn't stayed. She thought about a man who said, I ain't a warm man, as a warning, as a disclaimer, as a preemptive apology for everything he couldn't give. When the truth was that warm and steadfast were not the same thing, had never been the same thing, and the man who lit a stove for you before he left, and left bread on the table, and put a bolt on your door, was doing something more honest than warmth. How was staying? In the only way he knew. She was still sitting there when she heard his boots on the step, and the door opened, and he came in and read the room in one glance, the empty coffee cup that wasn't his, the open door and Clara at the table with an expression she wasn't fast enough to clear. Nora Hadley was here, he said. It wasn't a question. She was. He took his hat off and set it on the peg. What did she say? She told me about Dean, about the title searches, about the stories he's spreading. A pause. She said he's calling me a stray. Ethan's jaw went tight. He can call you what he likes. I know he can. Clara met his eyes. What I want to know is what you're going to do about the title. Howe was quiet for a moment, something moving behind his face. I've got the deed, he said. My grandfather filed it in 1851. But Dean's lawyer is claiming there's a gap in the survey records from 1872. If he can get a judge to order a resurvey... He stopped. It'll take time and money I don't have spare, and while it's in dispute, the bank won't lend, and if I can't make the fall payment on the water rights... Then he gets the water, Clara said. Then he gets the water. Flat. Final. And a ranch without water rights in this country is a ranch that can't survive the summer. Clara looked at him across the table, at this man who had given her shelter on the worst day of her life, out of nothing more than decency, who had taught her how to stay on a horse, and fix a fence, and hold a frightened animal still, who had lived alone so long that he'd forgotten to want company until company showed up and wouldn't leave. Then we figure it out, she said. Both of us. Ethan stared at her. I'm a teacher, Clara said. I know how to find records and read documents and write letters that don't leave room for argument. If there's a gap in the survey, there's a way to find the original filing. Deeds don't disappear. Someone knows where it is. She held his gaze. I told you I was willing to learn. You didn't say what. So I'm telling you now I'm willing to learn this too. Whatever needs doing. He stood there for a long moment. This big, quiet man with the closed face and the scarred hands, and the sister who'd left, and the wife who'd left, and the loneliness, so old, it had built a room in him and furnished it. And he looked at Clara, the way he'd looked at the trail on the first night, measuring whether it would hold. You are, he said at last very quietly, not what I expected. What did you expect? A woman who needed saving. Clara looked at him steadily. I did need saving. You saved me. Now I'm done needing that. What comes next is different. He was quiet a long time. Yeah, Ethan Walker said at last, and for the first time since she'd met him, the word sounded like something opening. It is. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day Clara found the original survey. She had spent the better part of 3 weeks working through every document Ethan owned, and he owned many, because his grandfather had been the kind of man who kept everything folded in oilskin and stacked in a cedar box under the floorboard beneath his bed, which was where Ethan had found it 15 years ago, and where it had sat untouched since, because Ethan was a man who trusted land more than paper, and had never imagined he'd need the paper to defend the land. She'd gone through all of it. Birth records, cattle tallies, water agreements, letters from the territorial office, 2 receipts from a blacksmith in Cheyenne, dated 1863, and 1 handwritten deed in ink, gone brown with age, that described the Walker land in terms of creek beds and ridgelines, and a particular stand of cottonwood that had probably been dead for 30 years, and this was the thing, referenced a filing number. A territorial filing number from 1851 that corresponded to a record that should exist in the county seat in Sheridan, and which Dean's lawyer was claiming did not. Clara copied the filing number 3 times in her own handwriting. She wrote a letter to the Territorial Archives in Cheyenne. She wrote a second letter to a lawyer in Laramie, whose name she'd found in a legal gazette Nora Hadley had brought up on her second visit, a visit that had included pie and considerably more warmth than the first. She sent both letters with the Tuesday stage and came back to the cabin to find Ethan at the table with an envelope in his hand and a look on his face she hadn't seen before. Not anger. Something older and quieter than anger. "What is it?" she asked. He put the envelope on the table without a word. She picked it up. It was from the county assessor's office in Sheridan. The language was formal and dry and entirely viciously clear due to a contested survey boundary. The water rights agreement currently held by Ethan Walker for the North Creek access would be suspended pending resolution of the title dispute, effective in 14 days. In the interim, the rights would be held in administrative trust. Administrative trust in Grover Dean's county meant Grover Dean. 14 days, Clara said. 14 days. Ethan stood and went to the window, his back to her, and she could see the set of his shoulders not collapsed, nothing like it, but carrying something enormous. "Without the North Creek, I've got maybe 3 weeks before the upper pasture goes dry. After that, I'm moving cattle to lower range, and lower range is Dean's land, and the moment my cattle cross his fence line, he's got grounds to seize them for trespass." He was very still. "It's neat," he said. "I'll give him that. It's a neat piece of work. The letters I sent won't come back in 14 days. "No," Clara said. "They won't." She set the envelope down. "Who else knows about this? Tom Halloran, Jim Hadley. Probably the whole North Range by nightfall. News like this doesn't stay quiet." His voice was even, but it had a quality underneath the evenness, like ice over fast water. "Dean will know I know. He'll be waiting to see if I do something stupid. Ride into town, make threats, give him cause." He turned from the window. "That's what he wants. Man does something stupid, it confirms every story he's been telling." "So you won't do something stupid," Clara said. "No, I won't." He looked at her. "But I don't know what smart looks like right now. And that—" He stopped. "That is a harder thing to sit with than I expected." Clara held his gaze. In 3 weeks, she had learned to read his silences, but this was something else. This was Ethan Walker saying plainly that he didn't know what to do, which she understood was an admission that cost him more than she could fully measure. "Then we think," she said. "Together. Sit down." He sat. They went through it piece by piece. Clara with a pencil and a sheet of paper. Ethan with his elbows on the table and his hands folded and his jaw tight. She wrote down everything: the filing number, the dates, the chain of agreements, the names of every man Ethan knew in the county who was not in Dean's pocket. By her count, that was 7, possibly 8, if Tom Halloran's brother-in-law was still working at the land office. She wrote Dean's timeline as best she understood it. She wrote the gaps. "There," she said, pointing at one. "Dean's lawyer filed the boundary challenge 6 weeks ago. The assessor's order came today. That's fast. That's too fast for something that should require a full title review." Ethan looked at where her pencil was pointing. "You think the assessor was told to move it? I think the assessor was told to move it before the challenge was filed. I think this was decided before you knew there was a question." She looked up. "Which means someone at the county level is already committed to this outcome. Which means you can't fight it at the county level." "Territorial court," Ethan said slowly. "Territorial court. In Cheyenne, which takes time." "Time I don't have." "Time you can buy," Clara said. "If we can show that the assessor's order was issued without proper notice, without the full 30-day review period, the territorial code requires it's procedurally defective. It can be challenged on process alone, independent of the title question." Ethan stared at her. "How do you know that?" "My father was a solicitor," Clara said. "I grew up reading case briefs the way other children read storybooks." She said it simply without apology. "I haven't practiced law, but I know what a defective notice looks like, and I know that if we can get a territorial judge to issue a stay, Even a temporary one, it buys you the time the letters need." He was very still. "You think you can write that argument?" "I think I already have most of it." She tapped the paper. "I need the exact date you were notified of the boundary challenge. And I need to know if you have anything. A letter, a receipt, anything that proves the assessor's office didn't send you the required notice." Ethan got up and went to the cedar box and came back with a letter dated 43 days ago, which was 3 days after Dean's lawyer had filed the challenge, and the letter was not a notice of dispute. It was a property tax acknowledgement. Routine. Signed by the assessor himself. "He knew," Clara said. "He knew the challenge had been filed, and he sent you a tax letter instead of a dispute notice. That's the defect." She was already writing. "That is exactly the defect." They worked until the lamp needed filling, and then Ethan filled it without being asked, and they worked some more, and at some point Clara realized she had stopped thinking about what she was doing in terms of helping him, and started thinking about it the way she'd thought about the fence line, the calf the first hour on the horse as a thing that needed doing, and that she was the person to do it. Not because he'd asked, because she was here, and it was right, and she was capable. She had the draft done by 9 o'clock. She read it aloud to him, and he listened without interrupting, and when she finished there was a long silence. "That's good," he said. "That's Clara, that's very good." She looked up, and something about the way he said her name stopped her. He'd called her Miss Moore, every day, for 3 weeks. Careful and formal. A deliberate distance he maintained, and now her name had come out of him, without the miss in front of it, without the formality. Just her name in his voice, plain and certain. And it sat in the air between them like something that had arrived and had no intention of leaving. Neither of them acknowledged it. "It needs to go out tomorrow," she said. "Not the stage, writer." "I'll write it myself," Ethan said. "You need to be here. Dean's men have been on the north fence twice this week. If you're off the property and they come, then what, you're going to hold them off?" "I held them off before," Clara said. "And this time I'll know why they're there, and what they can and cannot legally do, which gives me considerably more to work with than last time." He looked at her for a long moment with that same expression, the one she hadn't fully learned yet, the one that lived between measuring and something else she wasn't ready to name. "Jim Hadley will ride it," he said at last. "He's fast, and he owes me. I'll send word tonight." He pushed back from the table. "Clara." He stopped. The name again deliberate this time on purpose. "Thank you." It was not a warm statement, but it was given plainly and without qualification, and from this man that was its own kind of warmth. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Thank me when the stay comes through." Jim Hadley rode before dawn the next morning with the legal argument in his saddlebag and a letter of introduction. Clara had written to the Laramie lawyer, whose name she'd found in the Gazette. She stood in the yard and watched him go, and Ethan stood beside her 2 feet between them and said nothing, and she said nothing, and the silence between them had a different quality now than it did 3 weeks ago. Less empty, more inhabited, like a room where someone had finally moved the furniture. What happened next, neither of them saw coming. The morning was ordinary. Ethan rode the east fence, and Clara did the breakfast things and started on the ledger she'd taken over the accounts without ceremony about a week ago, because the ledger was a disaster, and she was a woman who could not look at a disaster without fixing it. She was deep in a column of numbers when she heard the horse in the yard, and she thought it was Ethan back early, and then she heard 2 horses, and then she heard a voice she didn't recognize saying Ethan's name. She came to the door. There were 3 riders, and they were not Dean's surveyors. These men were harder than that range riders, the kind that hired out for money and didn't ask too many questions about the work. The one in front had a letter in his hand, and he was looking at the cabin like he was taking inventory. "Walker here," he said when he saw Clara. "No," she said, and left the door open behind her, because leaving the door open meant she was not afraid, and leaving the door open meant they could not claim she had something to hide. "What's your business?" "Got a letter from Mr. Dean's office. Official notice. Needs to be received by the property owner." "I can receive it," Clara said. "I'm authorized to accept correspondence on behalf of this property." "You the wife. I'm the property manager," Clara said. It was not a lie exactly, and it was not exactly the truth, and she said it the way her father's solicitor voice had said things steadily, as if there was no other possibility. The man looked at her for a moment. He held out the letter. She took it. She did not open it. She held it and looked at him. "Is there anything else?" she asked. "Mr. Dean wants an answer by Friday." "Mr. Walker will provide an answer in his own time," Clara said. "On his own property, which this still is. Good morning." They left. She waited until they were below the tree line. Then she went inside and sat down and opened the letter and read it 3 times because she wanted to be sure she was reading it right. She was reading it right. Dean wasn't waiting for the territorial court. He'd filed a civil complaint in county court, not about the survey, not about the water, but about the original deed. He was claiming the 1851 filing was fraudulent. Not missing. Fraudulent. Forged, his lawyer said, by Ethan's grandfather, who had, according to Dean's evidence, been in Cheyenne at the time the deed claimed he was filing in the territorial office 60 miles away. If the county court accepted the complaint, the deed was void. The land reverted to territorial status. Dean would file for first claim the same day. Clara's hands were perfectly steady. She had learned that from the mountain. A thing could go very wrong, and your hands could still be steady, and that was when being steady mattered most. She needed Ethan. She went to the door and put 2 fingers in her mouth and whistled the way he'd taught her, for when she needed him to hear her from the east fence. 2 long notes and a short, and she waited. He came back in 9 minutes, and she counted them, and when he came through the door and read her face, he was already reaching for the letter before she offered it. He read it once. He put it on the table. He stood there with his hands at his sides. "They found a way," he said. "It's fabricated," Clara said. "The alibi is fabricated. Your grandfather could not have been in Cheyenne and at the territorial office on the same day. The territorial office was in Prescott in 1851. It didn't move to Cheyenne until 1869. Ethan went very still. "Say that again." "The territorial land office was in Prescott, Arizona in 1851. Wyoming wasn't a territory until 1868. The filing your grandfather made would have been with the pre-territorial federal land office in—" She stopped because Ethan was already at the cedar box pulling papers. "Ethan." "My grandfather's journal," he said. "He kept a journal. I never read the whole thing. It's—" His hands moved fast through the papers, not frantic, just precise, like a man cutting to the thing. "Here." He put a small leather journal on the table between them. Clara opened it to the date, July 14th, 1851. The handwriting was different from the deed, rougher. Older, the hand of a man who'd learned to write in a schoolhouse and had been doing hard labor ever since. But it was legible. And it was dated from a campsite that was, according to the paragraph she read, 2 days south of the federal land office in the federal district, not Cheyenne, not Arizona, the actual 1851 federal district office, with witnesses named. "He named the witnesses," Clara said. "He named the clerk." "Can we find them?" "We find the federal record," Clara said. "If his filing is in the federal record, which it must be because they gave him the deed, then Dean's alibi claim is worthless. You don't need witnesses. You need the original federal filing, which is in Washington, D.C., and which will show exactly where that clerk was sitting when he accepted your grandfather's deed." Ethan looked at her across the table. In the weeks she'd been here, she had seen him tired, and she'd seen him angry, and she'd seen him with that guarded, closed quality that was his natural state, and she'd seen him once with his hand resting briefly on a dead calf, with a tenderness so private it had stopped her breath. She had not seen him look the way he looked now, like something he'd been gripping very tightly for a very long time had just been offered solid ground. "You knew this," he said, "about the territorial office." "I looked it up," she said, "in the Legal Gazette. When I found the filing number in the deed, I wanted to understand the context. I thought it might matter. I didn't know how much." He pulled the chair out and sat down slowly, and he put both hands flat on the table, and he looked at his hands for a moment. "My grandfather built this place by himself," he said. "He came from nothing. He had nothing when he got here. He filed that deed legal and right because he understood that a man who builds on land he doesn't own is building a coffin." His voice was even, but something in it had gone raw in the way of things said finally, after years of being thought. He's been dead 30 years. Dean is standing up in county court calling him a forger. I know, Clara said. I am going to see this man put down. Ethan said very quietly. I don't mean violence. I mean legally, permanently, and publicly. I want him to lose in front of every man in this county who's been too afraid to say no to him. Then we write another letter, Clara said. This one to Washington. And I need you to tell me everything you know about Grover Dean, every property dispute, every man he's run off, every agreement he's broken. Every one. That'll take all night. I have nowhere else to be, Clara said. He looked at her, and there was something in the looking that was different from all the other times he'd looked at her. Something that had moved past measuring and past guarding and into a territory neither of them had named, and she thought for a moment he might say something that would change the shape of things between them. But instead, he stood and went to the stove and put on coffee, because he was an honest man, and honest men she had found did not say things before they were certain of them. It was 2 in the morning when the work was done. They had a complete record of Dean's land acquisitions across 7 years. They had 3 names, men Dean had run off their land, 2 of whom were still in Wyoming, 1 of whom had filed a complaint with the territorial office that had been dismissed on procedural grounds, and who Clara believed would be very willing to refile if properly approached. They had the journal entry. They had the draft of the Washington letter. They had something that looked for the first time like a case. Clara was cleaning the pen NIB, and Ethan was banking the stove, and the cabin was very quiet, and then she heard it, not from outside, not from the yard, but from somewhere down the trail, a sound she'd learned to recognize and had hoped not to hear at this hour. Horses. Multiple horses. Moving fast. She and Ethan looked at each other. Howe was at the door in 3 steps, and she was right behind him, and the night was cold and very dark, and the horses were close now, and then a voice shouted from down the trail, "Walker, Ethan, Walker!" And the voice was Tom Halloran's, and it was broken in the middle, the way a voice breaks when something terrible has happened. Ethan opened the door. Tom Halloran was off his horse before it stopped, and behind him was Jim Hadley, and Jim's arm was wrong, hanging wrong at a wrong angle, and his face was white in the moonlight. "What happened?" Ethan said. Not a question, a command. "They stopped him on the Sheridan Road," Tom said, and he was breathing hard, his words coming in pieces. "4 men. Dean's men, we think, though we can't prove it. They took the saddlebag. They took Ethan. They took the letter, the legal argument, everything." Clara's stomach dropped. "Jim," she said, already moving toward him. "Your arm." "It ain't broke," Jim said, tight and pale. They weren't trying to hurt me, just stop me. Took the bag and rode." He looked at Ethan, and she could see the shame in it, the way a man carries what feels like failure, even when it isn't his fault. "I'm sorry. I tried to hold on to it. I'm sorry." "Don't," Ethan said, and it came out clear and firm. "You rode. They stopped you. That's on them." He put a hand briefly on Jim's good shoulder, and she saw Jim's jaw work with the effort of not showing how much the contact meant. "Come inside. Clara will look at that arm." They came inside, and Clara looked at Jim's arm. She had learned a great deal about injuries in the past 3 weeks, and it was not broken, but it was badly wrenched, and she wrapped it tightly and got him coffee, and did not let herself think about the letter until he was settled, because a person's body in front of her mattered more than paper, even paper that might mean everything. But when Jim was settled and Tom had his coffee and the horses were tied and watered, she sat down and let herself think about it. Dean's men had taken the legal argument, which meant Dean knew she'd written it, which meant Dean had known what they were doing before they'd finished doing it, which meant someone had told him someone who'd seen the Hadley rider leave before dawn, someone who'd known what he was carrying, someone who'd been watching. Ethan came to stand beside her, and he said very low, so the other men wouldn't hear, "He's got eyes on this property." "Yes," she said. "He knew about the letters to Laramie and Cheyenne." "Yes." She looked at him. "Can he intercept those?" "Stage mail is federal. He can't touch it without—" Ethan stopped. "He can delay it. He's got friends at the Sheridan office. He can't steal it, but he can slow it down." "Then we have to assume the letters don't arrive in time," Clara said. We have to assume we're on our own for the 14-day window. She was quiet a moment. Ethan. Who knew Jim was riding before dawn? He was still. Me, you, Jim, Tom, and whoever was watching the trail. Yes. His jaw tightened. Dean doesn't wait for a judge. He takes first and argues later, which means... He stopped and she saw it cross his face before he said it. He's going to come for the water before the 14 days are up. Before the stay can arrive, Clara said. Before the letters come back. Before anything can stop him legally. He moves in the gap. When? Tom asked from across the room. He'd been listening, and she didn't mind, because Tom Halloran was a man she'd learned to trust, which in 3 weeks was not nothing. Soon, Ethan said. Maybe tomorrow, maybe the day after, but soon. He looked at Tom, then at Jim, then at Clara. His face was entirely clear. No anger, she could see no fear. Just that absolute steadiness she'd come to know was his truest quality. A mountain doesn't panic. A mountain doesn't negotiate. A mountain stands. He's not getting the water, Ethan said. Not while I'm breathing. You can't stop him with a rifle, Tom said. He'll have the law on his side, or the version of the law he's bought. I know that. Ethan looked at Clara. What do we have that he doesn't know about? She looked at the table, at the papers, at the journal with the 1851 date, the witnesses, the clerk's name. At the copy of the legal argument she'd kept because she was a teacher, and teachers kept copies always, and she had copied every word longhand the night before. Jim rode, and the copy was in the cedar box under the floor that Dean didn't know about and couldn't have taken. We have the journal, she said, and the copy of the argument, and the 3 men Dean ran off their land. She paused. And we have the fact that he moved today. Ethan frowned. That hurts us. No, Clara said. It tells us something. Dean is afraid of what we have. A man who is winning slowly doesn't send riders to steal papers in the dark. A man who is winning slowly waits. He sent those men tonight because he's seen something that scared him. She looked at the journal. It's the deed. It's the grandfather's deed. He knows about the filing number. He knows we found something he didn't expect. Tom leaned forward. You're saying he's on a shorter clock than he's letting on. I'm saying he's on a clock, Clara said. And if we can find out what's driving it, what deadline he has that we don't know about, we might be able to use it. Ethan was watching her, and his eyes had that quality again, that thing past measuring, and Jim said from his chair, arm-wrapped and face still pale. Ethan, where'd you find this woman? Platform in Dust Hollow, Ethan said. She was standing in the middle of nothing with 3 trunks and a veil in the dirt, and she looked like she was going to burn the whole town down rather than ask for help. Clara looked at him. I was looking back. You told them that, she said. It's true, he said. And there was something in the plain way he said it, something in the fact that he had said it at all in front of Tom and Jim, in front of witnesses, that stopped her in a way she hadn't been stopped before. She had been prepared for many things on this mountain. She had not been prepared for this man to tell someone else her story with that particular note in his voice, as if it was something worth telling, as if it was something he was glad of. She looked back at the papers before she could decide what to do with her own face. We need to get word to the other men, she said. The ones Dean ran off. Can they be reached tonight? Cal Reeves is in Clearwater, Tom said. Day's ride. Send for him, Clara said. And we need to secure the water gate. If Dean moves first, we need people there. Legal witnesses, not just ranch hands. People who can testify to what they see. She looked at Ethan. He can't take the water if there are witnesses to how he does it. You want a crowd at the water gate, Ethan said. I want every man on the North Range standing at that water gate when Dean's men arrive, Clara said. Not with weapons, with their names. Every man who signs a witness statement makes it harder for a county judge to rule in Dean's favor. He can buy one judge. He cannot buy every man in this valley's reputation. Tom stood up. Jim can't ride. I'll go to Clearwater tonight. I'll bring Cal. He looked at Ethan. You think she's right about him being on a clock? I think, Ethan said carefully, that she has been right about every single thing she's told me in 3 weeks. He looked at Clara. And I've learned better than to argue with that. Tom went. Jim stayed arm-wrapped asleep in the chair within 20 minutes. Clara sat at the table with the journal open to July 14th, 1851, and she was very tired and very awake at the same time, and she was writing down the clerk's name. James P. Whitfield filed under Territorial Land Act, and the initials after the entry in her grandfather's hand, JPW, confirmed when she realized Ethan was still at the table not working, just sitting watching her write. "Go to sleep," she said. "You have to ride the north fence at first light." "Clara." She looked up. He almost never said her name. He was sitting with his arms on the table, and there was something on his face. She'd been watching approach for 3 weeks, something that had been coming. The way weather comes, you see it a long way off. You watch it move toward you, and when it finally arrives, you realize all your preparation was for a different thing than this. "I need to tell you something," he said, "before tomorrow happens and I don't get the chance." She waited. "When I picked up that trunk on the platform," he said, "it was because of what I told you, the man who helped me years ago and dying without being paid back. That was true. That was the reason I started." He was looking at his hands. "But somewhere between the platform and the cabin, it stopped being that reason. And I have not been honest with myself about when that happened or what it means, but I don't want to be the man who says nothing important until the moment it's too late." He looked up. "You came here to survive. That's done. You've survived. You've done more than survive. This place is different because you're in it. I'm different, and that is—" He stopped. The word he needed didn't come, and she watched him struggle with its absence. This man who'd said more true things plainly than anyone she'd known, and who had finally arrived at the thing plain speech couldn't carry. "I don't know what you want," he said at last. "For your life. After all this. I don't know if it's this mountain or Boston or somewhere else entirely, and I'm not asking you to decide that tonight. But I needed you to know, before tomorrow, that you are not a stray I took in." He held her gaze. "You're the reason the light's on when I come home." The cabin was very quiet. Jim Hadley breathed slowly in his chair. The fire settled. The journal lay open between them to a dead man's handwriting. A man who had built something on this land and refused to let it be taken, and his grandson sat across from a woman from Boston, who had come with 3 trunks and a ruined veil, and had spent 3 weeks learning the shape of everything this man kept behind closed doors. And she had found that the shape of it was not stone. It was a room. It was a room that had been empty a very long time, and it was very careful and very still, and it was. She understood this now all at once, without any more defense against it. It was home. "I know," she said quietly. "Ethan, I know." He nodded once, and she nodded back, and neither of them said anything more, because some things are complete without a closing sentence, and this was one of them. She went back to writing. He went to the window and watched the dark standing guard the way he always stood guard, but the set of his shoulders was different. Something had come down that he'd been carrying alone. And when dawn came gray and cold and exact, it found them both still at their posts, her at the table, him at the window, awake and ready and facing the same direction. Dawn came in hard and cold, the way it always did at this elevation, and Clara was still at the table when it did. She had not slept. She wasn't sure Ethan had either, though. At some point in the small hours he'd stopped standing at the window and had sat in the chair across from her and worked in silence, going through every cattle record, every water usage log, every document that touched the North Creek Agreement. They had not spoken again about what he'd said to her because what he'd said had been complete in itself and didn't need talking around, and also because they had work to do, and both of them were the kind of people who did the work in front of them before they attended to everything else. Jim Hadley woke at first light, sat up in the chair, looked at his arm and said, "I'm writing today." "You're not," Ethan said from across the room without looking up from the ledger. "I can ride with one arm. You can't, and I need you here." Ethan looked up then. "I need a man at this cabin today, someone who can—" He stopped, and Clara knew what he'd been about to say, and she knew he'd stopped because of her, because he wasn't sure how she'd take it, and she decided to save them both the effort. "Someone who can look after things if I have to go with you," she said. "I know. Jim, can you shoot left-handed?" Jim blinked. Passively. "Then you stay," Ethan said. "And you don't let anyone pass the cabin door who doesn't have business here." "You think they'll come here?" Jim asked. "I think if Dean is moving fast, he moves everywhere at once," Clara said. "The water gate is where he wants us, distracted, occupied, away from the property. This cabin and what's in it." She meant the journal, the copy of the argument, the cedar box, all of it. "That's what he actually can't afford for us to have." Ethan looked at her steadily. "You think today?" "I think today," she said. He nodded once, picked up his hat, and went out to saddle the horses. Tom Halloran arrived from Clearwater before 7, and with him came Cal Reeves, a lean, weathered man in his late 50s, with a limp from an old injury, and eyes that had the particular quality of a man who has watched someone take something from him and has not finished thinking about it. He shook Ethan's hand on the step, and then he looked at Clara and said, "You're the one wrote the legal argument." "Yes," Clara said. "Dean's men took it off the rider." "I have the copy," she said. "And I need to ask you some questions about the boundary dispute he used to take your property, specifically about the survey that was cited. Do you have time?" Cal Reeves looked at her for a moment, with an expression she'd learned to recognize in the past weeks, the expression of a man who is recalibrating what a woman is capable of and doing it in real time. Then he said, "Ma'am, I got nothing but time when it comes to Grover Dean." They sat at the table, the four of them, Ethan, Tom, Cal, and Clara, and she went through it with the precision she'd been trained to. From childhood, her father's voice in her ear. Get the facts first. Build the argument on the facts. Don't let sentiment do what evidence should do. Cal Reeves had a survey map from his own dispute 3 years old, and when Clara put it beside Ethan's grandfather's deed and the journal entry, she saw it immediately. The same creek was cited in both by 2 different names, which was not uncommon in this country, but the bearing listed in Dean's survey was wrong. It was wrong by 4 degrees, which in flat country might not matter, and in mountain country, with creek beds that followed ridge lines, put the boundary almost 200 yards off. He used the same survey, she said, the same flawed survey, for both properties. "Can you prove it?" Ethan asked. "If the Federal Land Office in Washington has the original baseline survey from 1851, which it does, it must, because that's the primary document. Everything else is derived from then. Yes, every false survey in this county can be measured against it." She looked at Cal. "How many other men has Dean disputed?" "That I know of personally 4. That I've heard tell of could be 7. 7 boundary disputes with the same surveyor," Clara said. Tom said quietly, "That surveyor is Dean's brother-in-law." The table went silent. Clara put her pencil down. "Say that again." "Hector Briggs does all Dean's surveying, married Dean's youngest sister in 1878. Tom looked around the table. "Everybody in the valley knows it. Nobody's put it in writing because nobody's had cause to before now or nerve enough." "I have nerve enough," Clara said. "And I have cause." She was already writing. "A surveyor whose work exclusively benefits his brother-in-law's land acquisitions is not a surveyor. He's a conspirator. And 7 properties is not a pattern. 7 properties is a scheme." She looked at Ethan. "This is what Dean is afraid of. Not the deed. Not the water rights. This all of it together. 1 property is a dispute. 7 is fraud. Federal fraud because the surveys were filed with the Territorial Land Office under federal authority." Ethan had gone very still. "Federal jurisdiction." "Federal jurisdiction," Clara said, "which is above the county judge Dean has in his pocket, above the county assessor, above the territorial court." She met his eyes. "If we can get this in front of a federal land commissioner, Dean doesn't just lose the water rights. He loses the right to any of it." The room was very quiet. Then Cal Reeves said slowly, "The way a man says something, he's waited 3 years to say. Tell me what you need me to do." What happened next happened fast. Ethan and Tom rode for the North Water Gate at 8, with Cal and 2 of Tom's hands behind them. Clara watched them go from the step, And she felt the same thing she'd felt on the platform at Dust Hollow when the train pulled away behind her, the knowledge that something was about to change, and that she was standing exactly at the hinge of it. She went inside and sat down across from Jim Hadley and said, "While they're at the Watergate, someone is going to come here." Jim straightened. "How sure are you?" "Sure enough." She looked at the cedar box still under the floorboard. "Dean wants the journal. It's the one piece he can't reproduce or dispute. Ethan's grandfather's handwriting dated with witness names." She paused. "If someone comes, I'm going to answer the door." "Clara, I'm going to answer the door," she said again, "and I'm going to handle it. I need you to stay in the back room with the cedar box and not come out unless I call for you. Can you do that?" Jim looked at her. He was a man who'd worked this range for 12 years, and he was sitting with a wrenched arm in a borrowed chair, and he looked at this woman from Boston who'd been here less than a month, and something in what he saw made him say, "Yes, ma'am," without another word. She did not have long to wait. At 9:20, a single rider came into the yard. Not Dean's hard men, not the range riders from 2 days ago. This one was different. Polished boots, good coat, a man who worked in offices and understood paper. He had a leather satchel and the careful, neutral expression of someone who has been told to be persuasive. Clara opened the door before he knocked. "Miss Whitmore," he said, which stopped her. He knew her name, which meant Dean knew her name, which meant Dean had done his research on her specifically, and she filed that away because it was important. "My name is Philip Coates. I'm an attorney representing Mr. Grover Dean." "I know who you represent," Clara said. She did not step aside to let him in. "What do you want? I'd like to speak with you privately if I may." He glanced past her into the cabin. "It concerns your situation here, and a proposal Mr. Dean believes would be of genuine benefit to you." "My situation," she said. "You're an unmarried woman living on a man's property without family or legal standing in this county." He said it pleasantly without cruelty, which was worse than cruelty, because it was meant to sound like concern. "Mr. Dean is prepared to offer you passage back to Boston, first class, plus a sum of $200. In exchange for leaving," Clara said. "In exchange for removing yourself from a legal dispute that isn't yours, and that frankly is unlikely to resolve in Mr. Walker's favor." He opened the satchel. "There are papers, a simple affidavit, stating that you have no legal claim to this property, that you're not a party to the dispute, and that I'll go," Clara said. "And in going remove the legal argument I wrote the copy I kept and the research I've done on 7 fraudulent boundary surveys." She watched his face. "That's what you're actually here for. You're not here to help me. You're here because Dean is afraid of what I know." Coates was good. He barely moved. But she'd been reading rooms full of children for 6 years, and she knew when something landed. Mr. Dean sent range riders to steal documents off a courier in the dark," Clara said. "And then he sent you in daylight with money and manners. That's not a man who's winning. That's a man who's running out of road." She folded her hands in front of her. "You can tell Mr. Dean that I am not a party to this dispute, because I choose not to be. I am here as a free woman on property where I have been offered shelter by the owner. I have no legal obligation to leave, and I have every right under territorial law to assist in the preparation of legal documents on behalf of whoever I choose." She held his gaze. "And you can tell him that the copy is not here." It was a lie. The copy was 6 feet beneath her in a cedar box under a floorboard. But Coates didn't know that. "Miss Whitmore." He tried once more, quieter. $200 is a great deal of money for a woman in your position." "My position," Clara said, "is standing on solid ground. Yours is representing a man who commits federal fraud. I'd think carefully about that, Mr. Coates, before you come back up this mountain again." She stepped back. "Good morning." She closed the door. She stood on the other side of it for a count of 10, her mother's 10 counts, and then she called out, "Jim, he's gone. You can come out." Jim came out of the back room with the cedar box under his good arm, and the expression of a man who has just witnessed something he will be telling people about for years. $200, he said. "I was going to go higher," Clara said. "But I didn't want to find out how high." She sat down at the table. Her hands were shaking now, finally, the way they'd shaken after the surveyors the first time, but she was beginning to understand that the shaking came after, not during, and that this was simply how a body processed the gap between what it had just been asked to do and what it had actually done. "He's going to go to the Watergate," she said. "Coates, he'll go to Ethan now, same offer." "Ethan won't take it," Jim said flatly. "I know he won't." She looked at the box. "But Dean will use it as another delay, another negotiation. While we're talking, he's moving." She stood. "I have to get to the Watergate." "Clara, I have to be there," she said. "Because what happens at the Watergate today is going to be witnessed by every man on the North Range, and those men's accounts are going to matter, and I am the only person who knows the full legal picture, and if something goes wrong—" She stopped. "I have to be there." Jim looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the door and the mountain outside it, and back at her. He did the math of a man calculating risk against necessity. Then he said, "There's a faster trail, South Fork, takes 40 minutes off the ride." "Show me," Clara said. He showed her. She rode the South Fork alone, which was the steepest and most technical trail she'd attempted, and she stayed on the horse the whole way, and she didn't think about that afterward, because there wasn't time. And maybe that was when it became simply who she was, not something she'd survived, just something she could do. She heard them before she saw them. Voices. Multiple voices. Tense and overlapping. And then she came through the aspens, and the scene resolved itself in pieces. Ethan and Tom and Cal, and the two hands on one side of the Watergate, and on the other side, 4 riders she didn't know. And behind them, Grover Dean himself, which was the first time she'd seen him, and he was not what she'd imagined. She had imagined someone large, physically imposing the way villains in stories tended to be. Grover Dean was a compact man in his mid-50s, well-dressed, silver-haired, with the mild, reasonable face of a successful businessman. He looked like someone's respected uncle. He looked like the kind of man who was never the villain in any story he told about himself. How was speaking, and his voice was reasonable too, and Clara caught the shape of it as she wrote up the same offer, or a version of it dressed differently. A settlement. A fair price for the water rights. Generous terms. Nobody needed to go to court. Ethan's response when she arrived was 3 words, "It's not for sale." Dean saw her at the same moment Ethan did. She saw something shift in Dean's mild eyes, a quick recalculation, like a man who's placed a chess piece and turned to find the board rearranged. "Miss Whitmore," Dean said, "and she thought he knows my name, because he knows everything, because he has been planning this for longer than we've been responding to it." "Mr. Dean," she said. She stopped the horse beside Ethan. "Your attorney came to the cabin this morning. I thought a private conversation might—" "He offered me $200 to leave," Clara said loudly enough for every man at the Watergate to hear. "To sign an affidavit saying I'm not party to this dispute and to go back to Boston." She looked around at the assembled men. Tom's hands. Cal Reeves, the 2 hands, she didn't know all of them listening. "I want every man here to know that offer was made, and that I declined, and that I'm telling you why, because what Mr. Dean is doing to this property is the same thing he did to Cal Reeves's property 3 years ago. The same thing he did to at least 6 other men in this valley, using the same surveyor, his brother-in-law." She heard the sound that went through the assembled men, not loud, but present, the particular sound of a thing that has been suspected being confirmed. Dean's mild face didn't change, but his hands tightened on the reins. "That's a serious accusation. It's a federal accusation," Clara said. "I've documented 7 boundary disputes, 7 properties, 1 surveyor. I have the original 1851 federal baseline survey. She did not have it, not here, but the record existed, and she had the filing number, and that was enough to say, and every survey Hector Briggs has filed in this county is wrong in the same direction, toward your property lines, by the same margin." She looked at him. "A federal land commissioner won't see a boundary dispute. He'll see a pattern of fraud against private citizens on federally protected land claims." Silence at the Watergate. Dean looked at her for a long moment, and she held his gaze, and she thought of Josiah Ambrose's letter. The 3 sentences signed with an initial, and she thought of the calico women on the platform, and she thought of Harmon with his toothpick saying, She's your problem now. Walker. And she thought about all the ways she had been written off as a problem to be managed, and she kept her chin up, and she kept looking. You have no standing here. Dean said, quiet now, the reasonableness stripped back a little. You're not a lawyer. You're not a resident. You're not... I'm a witness, Clara said. So is every man standing here. What you do in the next 5 minutes is going to be witnessed by all of them. She paused. What would you like them to see? It was the longest silence she'd ever held. Then Cal Reeves said from beside her, I'll sign whatever she needs me to sign. About Briggs, about the surveys. I've been waiting 3 years for someone to put it in a sentence a court could hear. So will I, said Tom Halloran. One of Tom's hands, a young man she didn't know by name, said, My father lost 40 acres to a Dean survey in '79. I'll sign. Grover Dean looked at the row of men across from him. He looked at the Watergate. He looked at Ethan Walker, who had not moved and had not spoken, and who was looking back at him the way mountains look at weather, patient, immovable, entirely unimpressed. And then, without another word, Grover Dean turned his horse and rode away. His 4 riders followed. They went down the trail without looking back, and the dust they raised settled slowly, and it was done. Or the first part of it was done. The part that happened in the open in front of witnesses on solid ground. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Tom Halloran let out a long breath and said, Lord Almighty. Cal Reeves looked at Clara and said, Where'd you learn to do that? From a woman, Clara said, who taught me that if you know the truth of something you say it plainly and let it stand. She said the truth doesn't need ornamentation, it just needs to be spoken. Who taught you that? Ethan asked, quiet beside her. My mother, she said, and then looking at him, and you. He didn't look away. His jaw was tight, not with anger, not with the effort of containment, but with something that lived just below the surface of his stillness, that she now knew was not closed off, but only very, very careful. He reached over without any ceremony, and took her hand where it rested on the saddle horn. He held it for 3 seconds. Then he let go, because they were in front of people, and because he was who he was, and she didn't need more than those 3 seconds to understand everything they were. The legal aftermath unfolded over the following weeks. In the way, legal things unfold slowly at first, then with a momentum that became impossible to stop once it started. The letter to Laramie came back first from the lawyer whose name Clara had found in the Gazette, a man named Arthur Price, who had, as it turned out, been watching Grover Dean for 2 years, from a distance, waiting for something that could be brought before a federal court, and not just a county one. Clara's documentation was, as he wrote, precisely and thoroughly the thing I have needed and have not had. He would take the case. He would file in federal court within the week. The letter from Washington took longer. 19 days. But when it came, it was definitive. The original 1851 filing was on record in the Federal Archive in Ethan Walker's grandfather's name, with the signature of Federal Land Clerk James P. Whitfield, exactly as the journal said. The survey baseline put the Walker property boundary 214 yards north of where Hector Briggs had drawn it. The North Creek was entirely within Walker land. Ethan read the letter twice. Then he folded it carefully along its original creases and put it in the cedar box, and he stood with his hand resting on the box for a moment. And Clara stood across the room and did not say anything, because this was the kind of moment that deserved its own quiet. He built this place in 1851, Ethan said at last. He was 23 years old. He had nothing. He came out here with a pack horse and a rifle and an idea that a man could own what he built if he built it right. He looked up. He filed that deed because he understood something I forgot for a while. That a thing isn't real until you put it in writing, until you stand in front of someone and say, "This is mine, and here is the proof, and I will not yield it." Clara waited. "I forgot that for a long time," Ethan said. "I thought the land was enough, that what was real didn't need documenting, that a man who knew what he had didn't need to explain it to anyone." He looked at her. "You reminded me. Everything you did, the letters, the argument, the journal. You reminded me that standing on solid ground and being seen to stand on solid ground are not the same thing, and both of them matter." "Your grandfather knew it," Clara said. "He did." Ethan set the cedar box back under the floorboard. I should have learned it from him instead of from a schoolteacher from Boston who showed up in the middle of everything and fixed what I'd let go crooked. He said it plainly without apology, as he said most true things. That's a hard thing to admit to a person. You don't have to admit it to me, Clara said. I was here. I saw it. I know. He looked at her steadily. That's why I'm admitting it. 3 days after the Washington letter. A second letter arrived that neither of them had expected. It was from Boston. In a hand she recognized immediately, thin, careful, the loops of his A's that she'd once loved. Josiah Ambrose. She stood at the table with it for a moment before she opened it, and she was aware of Ethan in the room behind her, not watching, giving her the privacy of his particular kind of attention, which was the kind that turns away and still knows. She opened it. Josiah Ambrose had heard through channels she couldn't trace that she was involved in a significant federal land case in Wyoming. His letter was brief and in its own way revealing. He wrote that he hoped she was well. He wrote that circumstances had proven more complicated than expected. He wrote that if she found herself inclined to return to Boston, he would be glad to assist in her reintegration. The cross-marriage, he noted, had been a practical arrangement and remained so. Clara read it twice the way she had read Dean's assessor's letter, making sure she was reading it right. She was reading it right. The man who had thrown her away was offering to take her back now that she was something. She folded the letter along its crease and held it for a moment, and she thought about the woman who had stood on the platform at Dust Hollow with a ruined veil and $6 and no plan. And she thought about what that woman had believed about herself, that her value depended on being chosen by someone who had power, that love was something you earned through patience and good behavior and the right kind of education and the right kind of letter writing, that a woman's life was the life someone offered her. She put the letter in the stove. It caught immediately. The careful loops of the A's were the first thing to go. She stood there until the paper was ash. Then she turned. Ethan was at the table. He hadn't been watching the stove, but he'd seen her stand up, and he was looking at her now with that absolutely direct gaze she'd come to understand was his only mode of sincerity. "Boston?" he asked. "Boston," she said. He held her eyes, waiting the way he waited for everything, patient, giving her the room to decide, not pushing, not pulling, just present. "He wanted me back," she said. "Now that I'm apparently someone worth wanting." Ethan's jaw tightened. He say that? He implied it politely. She came to the table and sat down across from him. "I burned the letter." Something moved in Ethan's face, fast, strongly felt, and quickly steadied. "Good," he said, and it came out more than he probably intended it to, rawer than his usual register, and he seemed to know it because he looked down at his hands briefly. "Ethan," she said, "I need to tell you something." He looked up. "When I was on that platform," she said, "I thought I had lost everything. I thought the only thing worse than losing the life I'd planned was having no idea what came next. I was—" She paused, choosing the word terrified. Not of the town, not of the men, not of the night. Terrified of not knowing who I was without the plan. She held his gaze. "The mountain took that from me. You took that from me. Not because you explained anything or taught me anything wise. Because you treated me like someone capable of figuring it out, and then you let me figure it out." She was quiet a moment. "I came here to survive. I stayed because this is where I'm real. That's not nothing. That's the whole thing." Ethan was very still. "Clara," he said, and her name in his mouth had that quality again, the one she'd heard first on the night of Tom and Jim, when it had escaped him by accident, plain and certain. "I know what you said," she said. "On the night before the Watergate. I know what you meant. And I need you to know." She put her hands flat on the table, not reaching for him, just placing herself. Being solid. Being here. I am not going to leave. Not for Josiah Ambrose's letter. Not for Boston. Not for $200. A beat. Not for anything that doesn't grow from this mountain. He looked at her hands on the table. He looked at her face. He put one of his own hands over hers. Not a grip. Not a gesture of taking just the weight of it, the warmth of it, The blunt, honest press of a scarred hand on the hands of a woman who had come from nothing and built something in 3 weeks that would have taken most people a lifetime. "I know," he said. And then very quietly, "I know." The letter from the federal court arrived on a Friday, a clear, ordinary mountain Friday, 3 weeks after the Watergate, and it was addressed to Ethan Walker, property holder of record, and it confirmed the stay on the assessor's order, the opening of a federal investigation into Grover Dean and Hector Briggs for systematic land survey fraud, and the full restoration of the water rights to the Walker property pending final resolution. Ethan read it at the table with Clara across from him, and when he was done, he put it down and he looked at her, and what was on his face was something she didn't have a word for in English, something that lived past relief and past gratitude and past even happiness. Something quieter and more permanent than all of those, the look of a man who has stood on the edge of losing the ground under his feet and has felt it hold. "It held," he said. "It held," she said. And for a long moment there was nothing but the mountain around them, and the light through the window, and the weight of what they had done together, and the warmth of it, which was not the warmth of comfort, or of words, said right, but the warmth of two people who had stood in the same direction at the same time and had not moved. Nora Hadley came up the mountain that afternoon with pie and a bottle of something her husband had been saving, and Tom Halloran came, and Jim Hadley, with his arm in a proper sling, and Cal Reeves, who said very little, but stayed until last, and shook Ethan's hand at the door with a grip that meant everything he wasn't going to put in words. Clara stood at the step and watched them come and go, and felt something she recognized now, the same thing she'd felt on the first night above the dark town climbing. Not hope. Something under hope. The first plank of a floor. Only now the floor was finished, and she was standing on it, and it was solid, and it was hers. The federal investigation moved faster than anyone expected, which meant Grover Dean moved faster than anyone expected, and the 2 weeks following the court letter were the strangest Clara had known on the mountain. Not dangerous in the way the Watergate had been dangerous, not urgent in the way the night with Jim and Tom had been urgent, but charged with a different kind of tension, the kind that comes when something large is in the process of falling and hasn't finished yet. Dean's lawyer Coates came back up the mountain one final time alone, without the leather satchel, without the pleasant, reasonable manner. He came in the late afternoon, and he tied his horse at the post, and he looked older than he'd looked before, and Clara answered the door before he knocked again, because she had learned the sound of that particular horse. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Coates." He looked past her into the cabin, a quick look, and then back at her. "Is Mr. Walker here?" "Hi is," she said. "You can speak to both of us." He accepted this without argument, which told her something had shifted in what he was prepared to accept. She stepped aside, and he came in, and Ethan was at the table, and he looked at Coates the way he looked at most things, level patient without hostility and without welcome. "I'll say it plain," Coates said, and he sounded tired, the professional composure worn thin. "Mr. Dean is prepared to settle, all water rights restored, the boundary redrawn to the 1851 federal survey, all claims withdrawn, no further action against any property on the North Range." He paused. "He's also prepared to offer a significant sum to each of the affected property holders, in acknowledgement of damages." Ethan said nothing. He looked at Clara. "In exchange for what?" Clara asked. "Withdrawal of the federal complaint," Coates said. "The investigation closed. No public filing." Clara looked at him steadily. "No." Coates blinked. "Miss Whitmore, the compensation being offered is—" "I heard you," Clara said. "The answer is no. This isn't about money. It never was. 7 families lost land. One man rigged the system for 20 years, and not a single one of those families got justice because there was no record, no account, no public acknowledgement that what was done to them was wrong." She held Coates's gaze. "The federal record stays open. The settlement terms, the water rights, the boundary, the withdrawal of claims, those we accept. The rest is not ours to give away." Coates looked at Ethan. Ethan had not moved or changed expression. "She speaks for this property," Ethan said quietly. It was the simplest sentence. 4 words. And it did something to the room that Clara felt in her chest, a clean, solid feeling, like a beam set true. Coates took his hat from the table where he'd set it. Mr. Dean won't be pleased." "Mr. Dean," Ethan said. "Should have thought about that before he started." Coates left, and this time, neither of them watched him go. They looked at each other across the table, and there was a beat of silence, and then Clara sat down and put her forehead in her hands for one moment. Not from distress, but from the release of something she'd been carrying at a very particular angle for a very long time, and the release had a sound like a long breath, and a feeling like setting down a weight she hadn't noticed anymore because she'd gotten so used to it. "You all right?" Ethan asked. "Yes." She lifted her head. "I just needed a second." "Take two," he said. She laughed. She hadn't expected to, and it came out real and sudden, and she saw him react to it. The thing in his face that wasn't quite a smile, but was what a smile was made from. The federal investigation formally concluded 41 days after it opened. Hector Briggs surrendered his surveying license and faced a civil penalty. 7 boundary disputes were re-adjudicated in favor of the original property holders. Grover Dean paid damages to 6 families and quietly sold 2 properties he could no longer legally claim, and the county assessor who had issued the defective notice resigned his post, and the judge in Sheridan, who owed Dean favors, found that he was owed nothing anymore and started ruling on the merits, which was a change that benefited 12 people in the county who had given up expecting it. None of this happened dramatically. It happened in letters and documents and filings and the slow turning of legal machinery. And Clara tracked all of it from the table in the cabin with a precision that Arthur Price, the Laramie lawyer, wrote to say he found remarkable in someone without formal legal training. And she wrote back to say that formal training was one way to learn a thing, and necessity was another, and she'd had a great deal of the latter lately. Price wrote back a third time, the letter longer than the previous 2. The tone different, less professional, more direct, to say that the Territorial Bar Association was in the process of considering admissions procedures for individuals who could demonstrate sufficient legal competency, and that he would be glad to speak with her about the process if she had interest. Clara read this letter 3 times. Then she set it on the table and left it there for 2 days without saying anything to anyone, because she needed to understand what she felt about it before she spoke, and what she felt was complicated in a way she wanted to be sure she was reading right. On the second evening, Ethan picked the letter up, read it without asking, and set it back down. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. "That's a significant thing," he said. "It is. What do you want to do with it?" She had thought about this for 2 days. She'd thought about it in the way she thought about important things, now not frantically, not anxiously, but with the methodical patience she'd learned from this mountain, turning it over until she could see all its sides. "I want to answer it," she said. "I want to learn what I'd need to do. I want to understand if it's possible." She looked at him. "And I want to do it from here. Not from Laramie, not from Cheyenne, from here." Ethan sat down across from her. "That can be done," he said. "Study can be done from anywhere. Price could supervise by correspondence. There are precedents." He said it matter-of-factly, the way he said practical things, as if the question of whether she stayed had been settled long ago, and the only question now was logistics. "You looked into it," she said. "I asked Tom Halloran's brother-in-law. He's at the land office." He met her eyes. "I asked 3 weeks ago." She looked at him for a long moment. This man who spoke so little and did so much, who had put a bolt on a door for a woman who wasn't there yet, who had asked 3 weeks ago about legal correspondence study, because he had already decided in his own quiet way what he hoped she would choose. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "Because it wasn't my decision," he said. "I wanted to know it was possible before you decided. Didn't want you staying here because you thought you had no options. Wanted you staying because you wanted to." Clara was quiet for a moment. "That's the most careful thing anyone has ever done for me," she said. "It's a decent thing," he said, which was exactly what he'd said on the first night about the bolt on the door, and she smiled, and he saw it, and the thing in his face that wasn't quite a smile came closer than usual. She wrote to Arthur Price the next morning. What changed after that was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was the daily accumulation of a life being built from solid materials by 2 people who had learned through different roads and different losses that a thing built honestly was the only kind worth building. Clara studied law in the mornings at the table where she'd written legal arguments in the dark from textbooks. Price sent by stage and case records, she annotated in her careful handwriting in the margins. She was a good student. She had always been a good student, but she was a different kind of student now than she'd been in Boston, because now she understood what the law was for, not in the abstract way of someone reading about justice, but in the concrete way of someone who had held a frightened calf still and told a man to get off private property and burned a letter in a stove and stood at a water gate with the truth and watched a man who'd been winning for 20 years decide he was done. She still worked the ranch, not because she had to. Ethan never once implied she owed him labor in exchange for the roof, but because the work was hers now, in the way the mountain was hers, and because there was something about a day that had both physical work and mental work in it, that made her feel complete in a way she'd never felt in Boston, teaching letters to 8-year-olds, which she had loved, but which had never been the whole of what she had to give. Ethan learned things too, though he would not have put it that way. He learned to say more. Not much more, he was not, and would never be a man of many words, but the particular kind of more that mattered, which was not quantity, but honesty. He had spent 11 years living on this mountain, speaking only what was necessary, and keeping everything else behind the door he'd built after his wife left, and Clara had not knocked that door down. She had simply been present long enough and steadily enough that one day he'd noticed the door was open, and he couldn't remember leaving it that way, and he'd decided not to close it. He told her about his wife. Not all at once, not in a long confession, but in pieces over weeks, the way he told everything set down plain and then left to sit. Her name had been Margaret. She had been warm and funny and city-bred, and she had tried to love the mountain and found she couldn't, and Ethan had watched her grow unhappy, and had not known how to help her without becoming someone the mountain wouldn't recognize. And eventually, he had chosen the mountain, or she had chosen to leave, or some combination of the two that he'd never fully untangled and had stopped trying to. He had believed for 11 years that the fault was his entirely, that he was built wrong for loving anyone. He told Clara this on a Tuesday evening while they were at the table after supper, and she listened without interrupting, and when he was done, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You weren't built wrong. You were just with someone who needed a different kind of life. That's not the same thing." "Maybe," he said. "Not maybe," she said. "I know you, Ethan. I've known you long enough to know what you are and what you aren't. You are not a man who doesn't know how to love. You are a man who loves very carefully and very seriously, and doesn't do it until he's certain, and that is—" She paused. "That is exactly the kind of loving worth waiting for." He looked at her for a long time. "Clara," he said. "I know," she said. "No," he said. "Let me say it." He put his hands flat on the table the way she'd done on the night at the Watergate, the gesture she'd made her own, and that he'd adopted without knowing it. "I've been thinking about how to say this for 2 months, and I've decided thinking about it isn't getting me anywhere, so I'm just going to say it the way I say everything." He met her eyes directly without flinching, without the guard she'd spent weeks learning to see behind. "I love you. I love you the way I love this mountain, not because it's easy, or because it asks nothing of me, but because it's real, and because it asks everything, and because there is nothing in my life that means more to me than standing on it. That is what you are." He was quiet a moment. "You don't have to answer that right now. You don't have to answer it at all if it's not—" "Ethan," Clara said. "Yeah." "I moved here," she said. "I burned the letter. I'm studying law at your kitchen table." She held his gaze. "What do you think my answer is?" I was quiet for 3 full seconds, and in those 3 seconds, the last of the guard came down all the way. Everything he'd been keeping behind the door, and what was behind it, was not emptiness, and not damage, and not the absence of feeling, but the opposite, the very full opposite. A man who felt things deeply and carefully and permanently, and who had kept all of that behind the door because he'd been afraid that letting it out meant losing it. "I think," he said slowly, "that a woman who came to this mountain with nothing and built everything deserves to be asked properly." "Then ask," Clara said. He stood up. He came around the table. He stood in front of her, and he was very tall and very certain, and his eyes were the same dark brown they'd been on the platform the first day, and they had not changed. Only she could read them now all the way through. He didn't kneel because he was Ethan Walker, and kneeling was not his natural mode. He stood and he held out his hand, and when she put hers in it, he held it the way he held things he valued, not tight, not possessive, just present with his whole attention. "Clara Whitmore," he said, "will you stay?" It was not by any convention she'd been raised on a formal proposal. It had no ring, no speech, no borrowed poetry, no performance. It was a man who had lived alone for 11 years, asking the woman who had changed what alone meant for him to make it permanent in the most honest words he had, which were also the simplest. "Yes," she said, "I'll stay." He pulled her up from the chair and held her the way he did everything deliberately with his full strength and his full attention, and without any of the things that weren't real. She put her hands against his chest and felt his heartbeat slow and steady. The same heartbeat she'd felt through his vest on the horse on the first night, and she thought this was already familiar before I knew it would be this. The mountain was very quiet around them. The summer evening came through the window warm and gold, and neither of them said anything more, because everything had been said that needed saying, and the rest was simply this: two people standing in the home they'd decided on together, with the whole of it still ahead. What came next was not an ending. That was the thing about the mountain. Clara had learned the true thing underneath all the other true things. It didn't end. It continued. It asked you every morning to get up and do the work and face what was in front of you. And if you did that enough days in a row, what you had was not a conclusion, but a life. There was a wedding in October, simple and deliberate, and entirely theirs. Nora Hadley organized it without being asked, and then pretended she hadn't in the way of women who do necessary things, and know they are necessary, and don't require credit for them. Tom Halloran stood up with Ethan. Clara had no family to invite, which she had thought would be a sadness, and found instead was a kind of freedom. She had chosen every person in the room, and every person in the room had chosen her, and that was something very different from the assembly of obligation she'd grown up watching perform affection at family occasions. Jim Hadley came with his arm fully healed and danced with Nora until Nora's husband looked mildly concerned and then considerably more concerned. Cal Reeves came from Clearwater and brought his wife, a small, quiet woman named Grace, who embraced Clara at the door and held on for a moment longer than convention required, and said into her ear, "Thank you for what you did, for all of us." And Clara held on too, because Grace didn't need to say more than that, and Clara didn't need to answer more than the holding. Arthur Price sent a letter from Laramie. It arrived the morning of the wedding, which Clara considered either very good timing or very Price-like, because he was a man who understood the weight of a moment. He wrote to say that the Territorial Bar Association had accepted her application for a supervised reading program, and that upon completion of the required study period and examination, she would be eligible for admission, and that he looked forward to collaborating with her on the Dean case follow-ups and any future matters she might care to bring, and that he suspected the North Range had found itself a formidable advocate. She showed the letter to Ethan before the ceremony. He read it and handed it back and said, "I always thought the cabin needed a library." She looked at him. "Second room," he said. "Used to be my sister's. We can put shelves on 3 walls." He was perfectly serious. A woman studying law needs a proper library. The table works for now, but it won't work forever. "You've been thinking about shelves," she said. "Since August," he said. She stood there for a moment, holding Arthur Price's letter, and looking at this man who thought about shelves and bolts on doors and legal correspondence programs and all the quiet ways a life could be built to hold the person who was going to live in it. "You know," she said, "when I was on the platform in Dust Hollow, I thought my life was over." "I know," he said. "I thought the worst thing that had ever happened to me was happening." "I know." "It was the best thing," she said. "I understand that now. It was the best thing." He nodded once the way. He nodded when something was simply true and didn't need more words. They were married that afternoon under the autumn sky, with the North Range spread below them and the mountain holding them up the way it always had. Months passed. Seasons turned in the way of mountain seasons, which were not gentle about it. The winter was hard, and the spring was wet, and the summer came back around as it always did. And Clara Whitmore Walker, she had taken his name with the same straightforward deliberateness with which she'd taken everything that was hers on this mountain, sat at the table in the cabin, and opened her law books and worked. She passed the bar examination on her first attempt. The letter from the Territorial Commission came on a Thursday, and she was alone when it arrived, and she read it standing at the door. And then she sat down on the step in the summer morning and put her face in her hands, not from sorrow, not from relief exactly, but from the full weight of it. This thing she had not known to want. 4 months ago, this thing the mountain had made possible. This thing she had built out of documents and letters and a legal gazette and a man who believed she was capable of it before she believed it herself. She was still sitting there when she heard Ethan's horse in the lower field, and she didn't move. And when he came around the side of the cabin and saw her sitting on the step with the letter in her lap, he stopped and looked at her face and read it the way he read most things now, accurately and immediately. "You passed," he said. "I passed," she said. He sat down beside her on the step, close his shoulder against hers, and he took the letter and read it fully all the way through. And when he handed it back, his jaw was tight with something she knew now was not anger, but its opposite. A feeling too large for his face to hold in any conventional way, something that required the jaw and the stillness and the careful, controlled breathing of a man containing something enormous. "My grandfather," he said after a moment. "He filed that deed in 1851 because he understood that what you build has to be documented to be real." He was looking out at the valley, at the mountain, at the property that was theirs. "You filed yours today." Clara looked at the letter. She thought of the platform, the veil in the dust, the note in the boy's wrong, gentle voice. She thought of the calico women and Harmon's toothpick, and the $6 that were all she'd had, and she thought of a tall man stepping out of the shade of the water tower and asking, "Do you have somewhere safe to go tonight?" She thought of everything she'd been and everything she'd become, and the extraordinary, unlikely specific shape of the road between the two. "I came here with nothing," she said. "You came here with everything," Ethan said. "You just didn't know what it was yet." She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her, warm and solid and present, and they sat on the step of the cabin that was theirs, on the land that was theirs, in the life they had chosen together, with their eyes open and their hands steady and their full understanding of what it had cost and what it had been worth. Far below the North Range, spread wide in summer gold, the creek ran clear through the pasture where the cattle moved. The aspens were loud with wind. A hawk crossed the open sky and was gone over the ridge. There was work to do. There was always work to do. The east fence needed checking, and there were 2 new calves who required attention, and a letter from Cal Reeves about a neighbor's boundary dispute that Clara had promised to look at, and Arthur Price had written about a case in Sheridan that needed someone who knew this county and knew land law and knew what it felt like to stand on ground you had earned. There was all of that, and there would be more, and none of it would be easy, and that was fine, because neither of them had ever needed easy. They had only ever needed real. And this was real: the mountain and the morning, and the letter in her hand, and the man beside her, and the life they had built not from promises, and not from what someone else offered them, but from 2 people who had each lost the life they'd planned, and had the courage to build something better from what remained. The woman who had been abandoned on a platform in a dusty western town had come to the mountain with nothing, and had built a home, a purpose, a future, and a love that no one had given her and no one could take. She had built it herself. With her own hands, her own mind, her own stubborn unwillingness to be only what the worst day of her life said she was. And she was still building. That was the thing about a life worth living. It didn't end with a rescue. It didn't end when the villain was defeated, or the papers were signed, or the right man finally said the right thing. It ended, if it ended at all, only when you stopped choosing it. Clara Walker looked at the letter in her hand, at the name written there in official ink that was hers now and had been earned, and she chose it. She chose all of it. Every hard morning, and every cold night, and every fence that needed mending, and every document that needed writing, and every person on the North Range who needed someone to stand up and say, "This is wrong, and here is why, and I will not stop until it's right." She chose the mountain which had never once been easy and had given her everything. She chose the man beside her who had asked, "Do you have somewhere safe to go?" and had meant it with his whole life. She chose herself, the woman she had become, in the space between the platform and this step, the woman who had learned that strength was not something you were born with, but something you grew in the exact shape of what the world asked you to survive. And the mountain held them the way it always had, the way it always would. Solid. Unmovable. Home.